Welcome to the deep dive. Toxic bosses? We've all been there, right?
Sadly, it's something a lot of people experience.
Definitely. But the good news is we've got your sources right here. Articles from Forbes, The Muse, and in Seed Knowledge.
All looking at this from different angles.
Exactly. And, my own experience, I once had this boss insisted on, get this, reviewing every single email I sent before it went out.
Wow.
I know, right? Talk about micromanaging.
Yeah, seriously, some bosses just take control to a whole other level.
Totally. But before we get to solutions, we've got to make sure we're all clear on what a toxic boss actually is.
Absolutely. You have to recognize the problem before you can fix it.
Exactly. So according to the Muse, one of the biggest red flags is that constant feeling of insecurity.
It's not just constructive criticism, right?
No. It's like actively chipping away your confidence. You end up second-guessing every move.
And the psychological impact of that can be huge. Self-doubt, stunted growth.
It really messes with you.
Yeah.
And it's not just the insecurity, it's also feeling unheard.
Yeah. Like when you're trying to give feedback or suggestions.
It just vanishes.
Into thin air. Which often points to a deeper issue. A boss obsessed with control.
Yeah, makes sense. The Muse also talked about how they'll try to keep you stuck.
Stuck in a role with zero growth, no new responsibilities.
Like they see you as, I don't know, a robot instead of a person with potential.
Exactly. And then there's the whole two-face thing. The Muse highlighted that too.
Oh yeah, all smiles and sunshine for their superiors.
But then completely different with their own team.
So fake.
It creates this environment of distrust. No safety, no support, you're always on edge.
For sure. And Forbes adds another layer. Those crazy, unreasonable expectations.
Oh, you mean insane workloads and impossible deadlines?
Exactly. And zero work-life balance. They expect you glued to your desk 24/7.
A recipe for burnout, for sure.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
then, to top it off, Forbes mentioned the classic micromanaging.
Like, even when you've proven yourself capable.
Like, they just don't trust anyone.
More focused on control than on creating a healthy work environment.
Makes you wonder how they even got to be a boss.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole turning the team against each other thing.
The high school drama.
Right. Playing favorites, bad-mouthing people behind their backs.
Instead of encouraging collaboration and respect.
So messed up. So let's recap. We've got a boss who makes you feel insecure, unheard, stifles your growth, puts on a fake persona, sets impossible expectations, micromanages everything, and creates a toxic, competitive atmosphere. Anything I missed?
Oh, actually, the Muse pointed out one more thing, and it's maybe the most damaging.
Okay, what's that?
Giving negative feedback publicly, humiliating people in front of their peers.
Oh, I've seen that. It's brutal. Not constructive at all. Just
Absolutely. It's unprofessional, and it creates this culture of fear. Everyone's terrified to speak up.
So, for our listeners, if any of this sounds familiar...
It's a pretty clear sign you're in a toxic situation.
Yeah, but the good news is, you don't have to just take it.
Our sources actually offer some really useful tactics for dealing with this.
Ways to protect yourself, gain some control, and maybe even learn something from the whole mess.
Which is what we'll be digging into next.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Dealing with a toxic boss? I know, it can be seriously draining.
The worst, right?
But you're not powerless. Our sources actually had some pretty solid tactics.
Yeah, for not just surviving, but actually thriving.
Exactly.
And one that really stuck out to me from Inside Knowledge, understanding the pressures your boss might be under.
Not to excuse their behavior, obviously.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
But to gain a strategic advantage.
Right. Remember that creepy shadow figure thing from the Inset article?
Oh, yeah, in the nightmare. Right. Representing the stuff influencing the boss's action.
Exactly. Like maybe they're getting squeezed by upper management, impossible deadlines, crazy expectations.
So it's not necessarily personal. It's
the system sometimes.
Okay, so knowing that, how does it actually help us?
Well, it can help you tailor your communication, your approach, to minimize conflict.
Instead of just getting frustrated by, say, the micromanaging.
You can try to figure out what's making them so anxious about control.
Okay, interesting. And then from there,
you can start to think about setting boundaries, which in Seed also talks about.
Boundaries? Okay, with a toxic boss. That sounds like a tightrope walk over a pit of vipers.
It's definitely tricky. But it is possible. The key is framing it the right way. Focusing on, say, your workload and realistic expectations.
So less confrontation, more.
More like, hey, given everything on my plate right now, I'm not sure about X and Y. Can we talk about priorities?
Makes it more about logistics then.
than challenging their authority directly.
Right. And that kind of clear, calm communication is important for the next tactic too, which this one might be the most intimidating.
Giving upward feedback.
Yeah. I mean, how do you even do that? Give feedback to the person with all the power.
Right. Scary stuff. But the InSeed article had some tips. Specifically, how to frame it for HR, focusing on the impact of the boss's behavior.
Okay, so not just my boss is a nightmare, but
But when they did X, it made me feel Y, and it impacted the team this way. Concrete examples.
so it's less about attacking them and more about,
About the consequences of their actions.
and having HR involved
Can protect you, and hopefully make the conversation more productive.
okay. So we've got understanding their pressures, setting boundaries, and giving upward feedback. But what about day-to-day when you're just stuck there in the thick of it?
That's where self-care comes in. Big time.
Yeah, this stuff can really wear you down.
Both the Muse and Forbes were big on this.
The Muse even compared it to being lost in the wilderness.
It's a good analogy, right? It's not always the strongest who survives.
It's the one with the right mindset.
Exactly. So it's not about changing the boss.
It's about staying sane yourself.
Focusing on what you can control. Your reactions, your attitude, your self-care practices.
So like taking breaks, exercising, getting enough sleep.
Spending time with people you love, doing things you enjoy.
Basically refilling your tank.
Yes. And mindfulness.
Yeah.
And emotional intelligence, which Forbes talked about.
Okay, emotional intelligence. Break that down for us a little.
Sure. It's basically the ability to understand and manage your own emotions.
Okay.
And also recognize and respond to the emotions of others.
So how does that help with a toxic boss?
Well, for one, it helps you stay calm, even when they're pushing your buttons.
Instead of just reacting.
You can take a second, assess the situation, and respond in a way that, maintains your professionalism.
So you don't let them control your emotional state.
Right. And it also helps you understand their motivations better, anticipate their reactions.
Okay, so it can actually be useful in those tough conversations about boundaries or giving feedback.
Exactly.
Interesting. So self-care, mindfulness, emotional intelligence, those are all for dealing with the day-to-day. But what about bigger picture strategies, getting out of that environment?
Well, both the Muse and InSeed suggest looking at transfer options.
Staying in the company, but getting away from the boss.
Exactly. Best of both worlds, if you can swing it.
And the Muse was big on networking, both inside and outside the company,
Building those connections can open so many doors.
and give you a wider perspective on your career overall.
Exactly. It's about taking control, not letting this one bad experience define your future.
I like that. But, sometimes, even with all the strategies,
The only way out is out.
quitting.
It's the last resort, but sometimes it's the healthiest choice.
Both the Muse and InSeed touched on this, but they also emphasized doing it strategically.
Right. It shouldn't be an impulsive reaction. It's a decision that needs to align with your long-term goals.
So update that resume, reach out to your network.
Have a plan in place before you give notice.
Exactly. And it's not giving up or admitting defeat.
It's about taking charge, choosing to work somewhere that values you.
Love that. Okay, so we've covered a lot. Understanding the boss's pressures, setting boundaries, giving upward feedback, self-care, emotional intelligence, transfer options, networking, even quitting strategically.
A whole toolkit for dealing with toxicity.
But before we move on, I want to go back to something the Muse mentioned. Seeking support from others. Who did they specifically suggest?
Well, it depends on the situation, of course. They mentioned mentors, colleagues, someone in HR.
So those are all within the company. What about outside support?
They suggested therapists, career coaches.
Right.
Or even just a supportive friend or family member.
That's so important. Sometimes you just need that outside perspective.
Absolutely. And that support can be crucial in making the best decision for you.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's take a quick pause, give everyone a chance to digest all this. We'll be right back to wrap up this deep dive into toxic bosses, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the deep dive. So, toxic bosses, all the signs, ways to cope, even how to escape.
We've covered a lot.
We have, but there's one thing that really stood out to me from the articles. It's, the idea that even these horrible experiences, they can actually be valuable.
You mean finding the silver lining?
Exactly. Both the Muse and NC talked about this. Like seeing a toxic boss in action.
It's like a lesson in what not to do.
Right. When it's your turn to lead. So let's say your boss was a total micromanager, always breathing down your neck. That could teach you.
To empower your team, give them space.
Exactly. Or if your boss was terrible at communicating, always leaving you in the dark.
That could teach you the importance of being clear and upfront, consistent.
Yes. And if they were constantly playing favorites, pitting people against each other.
You could learn to build a culture of collaboration, respect.
It's like taking those awful experiences and turning them into
Positive actions.
Exactly. Shaping your own leadership style, creating a healthy environment for your team.
Turning poison into medicine.
I like that. And it shows that even in tough situations,
We can still learn and grow.
So to wrap up this deep dive, if you're stuck with a toxic boss right now, remember, it doesn't define you.
It doesn't have to limit your potential.
You have the power to choose how you respond
And learn from it.
and to shape your own future.
And if you need help, remember, you are not alone.
Mentors, friends, therapists, career coaches, there are people who can help.
And communities like ours, where you can connect with others who get it.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into toxic bosses. Hope you found it useful.
Remember, even in the toughest situations, you have the power to choose your response, to learn, to create a better future for yourself.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Mind Mosaic for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics.
We're an emerging channel, and we really appreciate your support.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.